A single letter carved into a tree, an L. Deep in the Australian wilderness, this was the first clue. It was found on a boab tree near the Diamantina River, a place so remote it feels like the surface of another planet. For years, that was it. A lonely initial, a silent testament to a ghost. Then another piece of the puzzle surfaced. A small brass plate, blackened by time, pulled from the dirt near a place called Sturt Creek. It had a name on it, Ludwig Leichhardt. These were the first whispers from an expedition that had been swallowed whole by the continent. An entire team of men, with their horses, oxen, and supplies, had marched into the vast, silent heart of Australia and simply ceased to exist. Imagine the scale of this. This wasn't one man getting lost. This was a moving town. 7 men, 50 bullocks, 20 mules, and 7 horses. They carried firearms, scientific instruments, and enough food to cross the continent. An operation of this size doesn't just disappear. It leaves a trail. It leaves wreckage. But for Leichhardt's final expedition, there was almost nothing. The silence they left behind was louder than any scream. Over the decades, search parties ventured into that same unforgiving landscape. What they found only deepened the mystery. They would stumble upon the remains of a camp, a scene frozen in time. Tools lay where they were dropped. A fiber pit was cold, the ashes packed down by years of wind and rain. It was as if the men stood up in the middle of a normal evening and walked away into nothing, never to be seen again. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an attack by local tribes, no messages carved into rocks, no desperate last words scrawled in a journal. Just an unnerving, ordinary scene of domestic life, abandoned in an instant. It's a profoundly disturbing image. The men weren't running from something. It seems they just stopped. One search party found a set of tent pegs still in the ground, the canvas long since rotted away. Another found a leather saddle strap perfectly preserved in the dry air, as if waiting for a rider who was only moments away. What could possibly make a group of experienced explorers abandon everything? What terror did they face in those final hours that was so absolute, so final, that it left no trace? This is where the story fractures into a dozen terrifying possibilities. Some said it was a mutiny, a violent end where the men turned on each other. But that would have left evidence, bodies, weapons. Others claimed they were killed in a flash flood, their remains washed away and buried under tons of silt. But the expedition was too large, too spread out for a single event to erase them all without a trace. The land itself seemed to be the killer, a place so vast and indifferent it could absorb a party of men and animals and leave not even a ripple. The heat is a physical force, capable of cooking a man from the inside out. The thirst is a madness, making the tongue swell and the mind see mirages. The isolation is a pressure that can crack the strongest will, turning hope into paranoia. Then came the stories, whispers from Aboriginal communities, passed down through generations. Stories of strange white men, starving and desperate. Some tales described men who were sick, their bodies shaking, their minds gone. They spoke of one man who wandered away from the group, alone, walking until he fell. These accounts were fragmented, often contradictory, but they painted a grim picture, not of a sudden catastrophe, but of a slow, agonizing collapse. A group of men disintegrating from within, one by one, their own bodies and minds becoming the enemy. This wasn't a fight against an external foe. It was a war against their own biology, in a place that offered no medicine, no comfort, and no escape. This case pushes the very limits of survival and logic. It's a puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, and the ones we have don't seem to fit. It's a journey into the heart of human endurance and the terror of the unknown. To join us as we uncover more stories of those who face the ultimate void, subscribe to the channel right now. We have so much more to investigate. Now, to even begin to guess what happened out there, in that vast, sun-scorched emptiness, we have to understand the man who led them there. Who was Ludwig Leichhardt? And what burning ambition drove him to gamble with so many lives, including his own, against a continent that had already proven it does not forgive mistakes? Ludwig Leichhardt wasn't a hardened survivalist. He wasn't a soldier or a man raised in the wild. He was a Prussian naturalist, a scientist. His world was one of careful observation, of classifying plants and sketching insects. But underneath the calm, academic exterior was a deep, burning hunger for fame. He didn't just want to contribute to science, he wanted his name carved into history, spoken in the same breath as the great explorers. He craved immortality. His first major expedition had been a shocking, near-miraculous success. He'd traveled thousands of miles up the coast, a journey so long and arduous that everyone had given him up for dead. For months, he was a ghost. Then he reappeared, thin, exhausted, but victorious. The colonies erupted. He was treated like a hero who had returned from the underworld. He was the man who had faced the great unknown and won. And Leichhardt, a man already brimming with self-confidence, began to believe his own myth. His ego, fed by public adoration, swelled to epic proportions. He started to see the Australian interior not as a physical, lethal threat, but as an intellectual puzzle. A wild beast he alone could tame with his superior mind. He saw it as a specimen to be cataloged, not an enemy that could kill him. This arrogance led him to plan the ultimate prize, the expedition that would make him a legend forever. He would cross the entire continent from east to west, a journey of nearly 3,000 miles straight through the blankest, most hostile part of the map. It's hard to overstate how insane this was. Today, with GPS, satellite phones, and four-wheel drives, it's a difficult trip. In 1848, it was considered a death sentence. The interior was a place of rumor and terror, a furnace that baked the ground so hard it shattered wagon wheels. A void where entire rivers shown on maps were nothing but trenches of hot sand. It was a place that didn't just kill you, it erased you. It swallowed men, horses, and wagons, leaving no trace, no bones, no story. It was a silent, patient killer. But the public, and more importantly, the investors, were high on Leichhardt's celebrity. They saw a hero, not a gambler. They gave him the money. He assembled his team, 7 men in total, a fragile mix of class and culture. There was Arthur Hentig, a practical station owner, likely the most grounded man in the group. There was Klassen, Leichhardt's own relative, perhaps there out of family loyalty. Then there were the 2 stockmen, Kelly and Stewart, the rough, hands-on workers meant to handle the animals. And finally, the 2 most critical members of the entire expedition, 2 Aboriginal guides, Womai and Billy Bombat. These men didn't need maps. They could read the land itself. They knew how to find water where a European saw only rock. They were the key to survival. The entire expedition's fate rested on whether Leichhardt, in his arrogance, would actually listen to them. The expedition was massive, a slow-moving town of men and beasts. They had 50 bullocks, 7 horses, and 20 mules. They were loaded for a long war. They carried over 1,000 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of lead for ammunition, and enough tea and sugar to last for what Leichhardt optimistically estimated would be a 2 to 3 year journey. But every piece of equipment, every bag of flour was a dead weight. The more they carried, the slower they moved. The slower they moved, the more water their animals drank. Their supplies were both their lifeline and their anchor, dragging them deeper into the desert at a crawl. On the 5th of April, 1848, they left the last settled station on the frontier. This was the final point of contact with the known world. Beyond this fence post lay nothing but theories and silence. They were confident. They were celebrated. They were walking off the edge of the map chasing a ghost of a river they believed would be their highway across the continent. They believed their leader was invincible. They had no idea they were already walking dead men. They weren't marching toward glory. They were marching into a trap, a silent, patient landscape that had existed for millions of years and had no intention of being conquered. The first few weeks were a lie. The sun was hot, but their spirits were hotter. They followed the creeks, pushing their bullocks and mules deeper into a land that grew drier with every step. The green faded to brown. The soft earth turned to cracked clay and sharp stone. Leichhardt's maps were based on hope, not reality. The great inland river he promised, their liquid highway to the west coast, never appeared. There was no highway. There was only dust. The silence was the first enemy, a profound, crushing emptiness that swallowed the sound of their own voices. Then came the heat. It wasn't just warmth, it was a physical weight. It pressed down on their hats, cooked the air in their lungs, and baked the ground through the soles of their boots. The animals felt it first. The bullocks, loaded with hundreds of pounds of gear, began to slow. Their heads hung low, long strings of saliva dripping into the dust. The mules, more stubborn, simply refused to move, their bodies trembling under the invisible assault. Water became the only god. Their entire existence shrank to the space between one water hole and the next. And the water holes were treacherous. Some were just muddy puddles, thick with insects and rot. They drank it anyway, straining the brown liquid through their teeth. Other times they would march for days toward a spot on the map, their throats raw, only to find a basin of dry, cracked mud, a tomb where water used to be. Each dry hole was a blow to their morale, a promise broken by the land itself. Friction began to spark within the group. The men were professionals, but survival erodes professionalism. They started watching each other, watching how much water each man drank. A man would be seen sharpening his knife a little too long. Another would hide a piece of dried meat, thinking no one saw. Each dry hole was a blow to their morale, a promise broken by the land itself. Friction began to spark within the group. The men were professionals, but survival erodes professionalism. They started watching each other, watching how much water each man drank. A man would be seen sharpening his knife a little too long. Another would hide a piece of dried meat, thinking no one saw. Each dry hole was a blow to their morale, a promise broken by the land itself. Friction began to spark within the group. The men were professionals, but survival erodes professionalism. They started watching each other, watching how much water each man drank. A man would be seen sharpening his knife a little too long. Another would hide a piece of dried meat, thinking no one saw. But everyone saw. They saw everything. Trust was a currency they had spent completely. Leichhardt, once their visionary leader, started to look like a madman. His endless optimism, his refusal to turn back, felt less like courage and more like a death wish. Quiet conversations happened around the campfire at night. Doubts were whispered. But where could they go? Turning back was just as dangerous as moving forward. They were trapped. Then the animals began to die. One by one, they would collapse, too exhausted to take another step. At first, it was a tragedy. They salvaged what meat they could. But soon, it became routine. A fallen bullock was no longer a companion. It was just more food. They were becoming harder men, more pragmatic, more desperate. Their own bodies started to betray them. Skin cracked and bled under the sun. Lips blistered. Sores opened on their feet and refused to heal. They were constantly tired, a deep cellular exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix. Their supplies, so carefully calculated, were dwindling at an alarming rate. The flour was infested with weevils. The dried meat was nearly gone. Starvation was no longer a distant threat. It was a quiet passenger riding with them every single day. It was in this state of desperation that they found it. A grove of trees they didn't recognize, bearing what looked like nuts or large seeds. They were starving. Scientific caution was a luxury they could no longer afford. The seeds were gathered. They looked like a miracle, a gift from a land that had offered them nothing but punishment. They roasted them over the fire, the smell filling the camp with something other than despair. It was the smell of hope. They ate them eagerly, crushing the hard shells and devouring the contents. For the first time in weeks, their stomachs were full. That night, the camp was quiet. The men felt a flicker of their old confidence return. Maybe Leichhardt was right. Maybe the land would provide. They slept, but when they awoke, something was terribly wrong. One of the men, Hentig, complained of a stiffness in his legs. He tried to stand, but his muscles wouldn't obey. Another, Klassen, said his vision was blurred, the edges of the world seeming to swim. They tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, a strange reaction to the new food. They tried to walk it off, but the body doesn't listen to orders when it's being attacked. As the sun climbed higher, the symptoms exploded. The stiffness in Hentig's legs became a crippling paralysis. He stumbled, then fell, unable to rise. Klassen wasn't just seeing blurs, he was going blind, the harsh Australian sun becoming a milky white void. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the morning heat. It wasn't exhaustion, it was poison. The life-saving food they had thanked God for was now attacking their nervous systems, shutting their bodies down one piece at a time. The trap had been sprung. Leichhardt stared, his mind racing, trying to process the impossible. He was a naturalist, a man of science. He understood botany, geology, the logical rules of the natural world. But this was different. This was a perversion of that logic. He looked from Klassen, clawing at his useless eyes, to Hentig, motionless on the ground, a living statue. Then his gaze fell upon the scattered remains of the strange beans they had cooked only hours before. The connection was instant. A horrifying, sickening certainty washed over him, colder than any desert night. He had done this. His ambition, his relentless push into the unknown had led them here. In his desperate search for salvation, he had fed his men poison. He had led them to a feast, and it was a death sentence. The weight of their trust crushed him. Every man who followed him had placed his life in his hands, and he had closed his fist around it. The camp erupted. It wasn't a loud, organized panic. It was a low, terrifying hum of suffering. Men doubled over, their stomach muscles knotting into stone, forcing choked gasps of air. Others stumbled blindly, calling out names that nobody answered, their voices swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the bush. The paralysis spread with terrifying speed. It was like watching statues being made in real time. First the legs would stiffen, then the arms, then the neck. Men froze in place, their faces locked in masks of pure terror. Fully conscious but unable to move a muscle, unable even to blink. They were prisoners inside their own bodies, watching the world through windows they could no longer control. The Australian interior wasn't just empty, it was armed. And they had walked right into its most subtle, patient ambush. The sun beat down, indifferent. There was no doctor, no medicine, no one to tell them what was happening or how to stop it. All they could do was watch their friends, their brothers in this journey be dismantled by an invisible enemy. The men who could still move huddled together, their eyes wide with animal fear. They looked at the sick. Then they looked at Leichhardt. One man, his face pale with terror, took a shaky step forward. "You," he whispered, the word sharp as a knife. "You told us it was safe." The accusation hung in the dry air. Leichhardt's authority was gone, shattered by a single disastrous meal. He was no longer a leader. He was just another man, waiting for the poison to claim him, checking his own hands for the first sign of a tremor, the first hint of stiffness. But some part of the explorer, the relentless forward-moving man, still fought back. He knew if they stayed, they would all die here. They would become another collection of bones for the desert to swallow. "We have to move," he croaked, his voice raw. The words sounded insane. Move where? Move how? Half the party was crippled. The animals, having grazed on the same deadly vegetation, were now trembling, some already collapsing onto the red earth, their own death rattles a grim echo of the men's suffering. They couldn't carry the sick. They could barely carry themselves. The choice was a nightmare made real. An unspoken question hung in the air, thick and poisonous as the plants they'd eaten. Do you stay and die with your friends, or do you abandon them for a 1 in a million chance at life? The group fractured right there. The bonds of loyalty, forged over thousands of miles of hardship, snapped. Some men refused to leave the dying. They would grant them the small mercy of not dying alone, sitting beside their paralyzed comrades, holding a hand that could not squeeze back, waiting for the end. Others, driven by the primal screaming instinct to survive, began packing what little they could. They didn't look at the men on the ground. They couldn't. To look at them was to look at their own future. One of the paralyzed men, his eyes wide with pleading, tried to make a sound, a desperate gurgle from a throat that no longer obeyed. He was begging them not to go, and they had to turn away. This was the end of the expedition, not with a bang, but with a horrifying, silent breakdown. A small group of men, possibly including a gaunt, broken Leichhardt, staggered away from the camp of the dead and dying. They walked with the poison already in their veins, a ticking clock in their blood. They left behind their comrades, their equipment, and a journal with a final cryptic entry. A last attempt to explain the unexplainable. They were walking into the endless, sun-scorched emptiness, not as explorers, but as ghosts, already dead but just too stubborn to lie down. Each step was a gamble against the paralysis creeping up their own legs. They were scattering, becoming individual points of suffering in a vast, uncaring landscape, ensuring that no single grave would ever tell the whole story. They walked until their legs gave out, but it wasn't a clean exhaustion. It was a ragged, horrifying breakdown. The poison was a patient executioner. It started in the gut, a fire that water couldn't quench. Then it moved to the muscles, turning strong limbs into trembling, useless weights. Vision blurred, the endless horizon swimming into a nauseating soup of heat and light. They walked with the ghosts of the men they just left behind, seeing their friends' final agonies reflected in each other's faces. Did they speak, or was the energy required for words too precious? More likely, it was a silent, stumbling procession, each man locked in his own private hell, feeling the paralysis creep up from his feet. The moment one of them fell, he would have been left behind, not out of cruelty, but out of a terrifying pragmatism. The moment one of them fell, he would have been left behind. The survivors didn't have the strength to carry a body, let alone a living man who could no longer walk. They were already carrying their own death inside them. One by one, they fell. The Australian interior, the vast continent they came to chart, simply erased them. It was a perfect, silent execution, carried out over miles and days. For years, there was only silence. Back in Sydney, Leichhardt was a hero. Newspapers printed hopeful dispatches. Then the dispatches stopped. Weeks turned into months, months turned into years. The public's confidence slowly curdled into concern, then into a nationwide dread. Where was Leichhardt? Search parties were sent out, brave men venturing into the same wilderness that had swallowed the expedition. They found nothing. It was like searching for a single grain of sand on a beach the size of Europe. They shouted his name into a landscape that swallowed the sound without an echo. They were looking for tracks, for campsites, for anything. But the sun and the wind had wiped the slate clean. Decades passed. An entire generation was born and grew old. Leichhardt and his men passed from a current event into a legend, a ghost story told to frighten children. But then the whispers started. Stories emerged from Aboriginal tribes, passed down from grandfather to grandson. Tales of strange white men stumbling through their lands. Men whose bodies shook uncontrollably. Men who grew sick and died after eating a local plant. Men whose animals collapsed beside them. For over a century, these stories were the only clues. Then, physical evidence began to surface, scattered across thousands of square miles like breadcrumbs from a ghost. A tree in the middle of nowhere, its bark scarred with a single clear L. A rusted plate from a firearm, half buried in the red dust. A single brass button from a jacket. Each discovery was a jolt, a faint echo from the abyss. But these fragments didn't form a map. They only deepened the mystery, proving the expedition had reached these remote areas before being annihilated. The central scene of the horror, the poisoned camp where it all fell apart, has never been found. It remains out there, a time capsule of tragedy. The ground zero of the disaster, preserved by the dry air, waiting. The journal that might explain everything, its pages holding the final, desperate thoughts of a dying man, was likely lost to the dust or the termites. Ludwig Leichhardt set out to conquer a continent and write his name across it. Instead, the continent conquered him. His expedition wasn't just a failure, it was a complete and utter consumption. They were consumed by the landscape, by their own ignorance, and by a plant they couldn't identify. Their final terrible discovery was not a new river or a mountain range. It was a poison that turned their own bodies into prisons, a biological trap from which there was no escape. What happened in those final days, as the toxin shut down their minds and bodies, remains one of Australia's most terrifying secrets. The story of the Leichhardt expedition is a brutal lesson in humility. It shows that ambition, without knowledge, is just a faster way to die. Here's the question we want to leave you with. Faced with an unknown, paralyzing illness in the middle of nowhere, what would have been the greater horror? Staying behind in a camp full of the dead and dying, or walking into that vast, silent emptiness to face the end alone? Let us know what you think in the comments below. These historical mysteries are more than just stories. They are warnings written in bone. To continue exploring the line between human endurance and total collapse, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We have many more secrets to unearth.